So we obviously pose a lot of questions in the perception machine outside.
Yeah.
You all kind of answered this one that we're asked now in very different ways. But do you think artists and scientists share a creative visual language? And is it possible to share a creative visual language?
I think maybe breaking it up between creative language or practices and then I think visual cultures between the two fields are probably, well, I go back to that Tilda idea. I mean, I think both fields absolutely have visual cultures. It's whether we talk about them in the same way. It's whether we have the same kind of points of reference. And I go back to what Mike was talking about earlier. I think your point about representation is key. It made me think back to, I think what was quite a controversial talk by Will Self, at fact, when he was talking about belief and whether, science has replaced religion in a way in terms of where we place our belief. So I'm really interested in what we think about reality, which you raised, Andy, and sort of the idea that the idea of objectivity is a construction. I mean, it's an idea. How do we think about reality? Yes, of course, there are things that are observable, but we've constructed the conditions under which those things become observable. So I'm really interested in thinking about science and art in those kinds of terms and really kind of interrogating and breaking down what we mean when we talk about images, what we mean when we talk about creative languages, visual practices, all of these kinds of things, because ultimately it does come down to this idea of a politics that is both personal and collective, I think, and where value is embedded and where power is held, and how these things operate in conversation, I suppose. And being quite conscious. I went to a really good talk by James, I don't know if any of you went to James Bridle's talk at the Blue Coat the other day, his book New Dark Age. And it's kind of moved beyond sort of science more into kind of big data and technology, but this idea that with this kind of accumulation of data, are we losing our capacity to make knowledge out of it? We've got a lot of information, but how do we engage that as knowledge? How do we make meaning from it? And I think that making of meaning is where the art and science come together again.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's good.
So experimentation really is key. I think all you've picked up is an experiment in any field is the driver of practice and generation of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I do also think that artists and scientists think about experimentation differently.
I think that's true. I mean, as a scientist, the experiment is very, very carefully prescribed and designed because you have to be confident that it is leading you either towards a correct conclusion or away from an incorrect conclusion. And so there is a precision to the design of the experiment which is essential. But I think that same level of precision and constraint to the design of an artistic experiment would probably defeat the purpose of the experiment. Because the whole point is to end up with an answer, I suspect, I mean, I'm not an artist, but a lot of the experiments that artistic friends do, the purpose is to end up somewhere they didn't expect to be. And you sort of don't want that in science. If you've designed your experiment really well, so that it either leads you to, a conclusion that sort of fits your initial question, or it denies it, that's fine. And if it denies it, it's usually more interesting because then you've got something new to play with. But it's not quite as open. And if it was as open, it probably wouldn't be very useful.
But don't you think that, so the older I get, the more irritated I get by the descriptions of art and science, and the fact that we even do that we even call them different things and try to pin them down into different things all the time. And I blame schools, but I also blame, and I can't remember his name, forgive me, but the 1980s scientist who came up with the left brain, right brain theory, which is remarkably persistent still and wholly wrong, and has been proved to be wrong so many times it's not worth counting. But it's so persistent. People love this idea that artists think differently to scientists, and it's just such rubbish. And it has created these silos of thought process in schools so that people have to choose between being a scientist and being an artist, and that just perpetuates it through society so that we have these, and I appreciate it's our idea, but these ridiculous conversations that don't just But it wasn't a question, it was just a
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond, I think that's why I find the James Elkins sort of survey of the field really interesting and trying to break it down into these, like, well, let's sort of try and identify all these different ways of working, and then from that try and draw out these 8 different models, because they all have different values and different affordances, and you know, ultimately what you end up with is strange attractions and drunken conversations. Like, it doesn't matter, because all of these things are present in different ways in a whole range of different projects. And one of the things that I didn't really talk about too much was coming from a context where there's so many artists in South Africa with a richness of material, whether it's, you know, hominins at, you know, the University of Witwatersrand, or, you know, the square kilometre array and kind of observatories in Sutherland. You've got artists working with this material, so many, in such a rich way, but this conversation doesn't happen. We don't talk about it in these terms, and so there's something interesting for me, is like why this sort of binary kind of thing takes root in some contexts and not in others. We're just not interested to have the conversation. It's like we're all just getting on with what we're doing, and you know, everyone have a nice time.
I'd like to comment and say that rather than science and art, we should be looking at the artist and the scientist more specifically.
Yeah.
So when I gaze at the collaborators that I have and the colleagues I have at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, there are so many scientists under that category that are illustrators, classical dancers, musicians, visual performers or not. I mean, it is extraordinary, the collection of people with the skills and talents that we don't even recognize in these people, because it's sort of hidden because your job is as a scientist and you don't get to express yourself at work as frequently as you would like to, and that might be a good thing as well. But I think looking at that and the diversity of the scientists and artists as well, it's phenomenal why we are so polarized on this science versus art instead of the scientist and the artist, and why can't you be both? Yeah.
But I think there is a problem though. It's not just in schools. I think it does go beyond that. It's horrendous in universities. But I think society as a whole, how we define success for a scientist or an artist is different.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be, but it is. I mean, a success for a scientist is publications in prestigious journals and you know, bringing in research grants and all that kind of stuff. Success for an artist might be selling a painting or having an exhibition or getting commissioned. And we do define success differently. You know, essentially, if I successfully get involved in art as a scientist, that's called impact. And if an artist successfully gets involved in science, that's called impact. And it's something separate. It's not what you're really supposed to be doing. And I think that is part of the problem. You know, when I was finishing my A-levels many years ago, and I was looking to what I wanted to do next, my A-levels were fairly broad: maths, physics, English, literature. I had moderately broad interests. I had to decide which of the two sides I was going to go towards. And I eventually ended up choosing the scientific side because I could see how I could have a job in science and keep going with art as an interest, but I couldn't see how I could do it the other way around easily. That may not be quite so true now, but I think it certainly was true then. And so we are made to make these decisions, partly because of the way we reward success, continuation and so on. And I think that's a part of the problem. Don't know how you change that. That's probably even harder than changing schools. But it is part of the issue, I think.
I would like to ask, Mike, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that it has been hard working with CERN because they have really eschatological understanding of the differences between art and science is properly understood. So I was wondering, how are you dealing with this as part as an institution, but being as an artist, because you're an artist as well? And also, how do you deal with this, their sort of corporate making sure that the difference is still there, even though they do the artist residency, because it's some sort of, from my understanding, also empowering their reputational image on an institutional level, in terms of some becoming a new kind of museum because it will not be probably able to perform anymore their scientific activities, because if I properly understood, they also arrived to a certain end in terms of the collider accelerator. So I was wondering if you have made up sort of
by choosing tricky artists who are going to ask the right questions, and by choosing the right artists. So in a sense, the panel that chose the artists that got the residencies. So Haroon Mercer, magic realist, goes to CERN and basically says what you're doing is magic. And that was deeply confrontational for the people that own the brand of CERN, or are basically protecting their corporate reputation in a sense. So there will be a lot of discussion around this exhibition as to the questions that the artists have raised through just making art. So he's basically saying they're shaman. As an irreverent artist. Yeah, he dresses up as a shaman and goes to CERN and does a performance piece in front of the labs. So, you know, I don't know, I'll shut up there. Come and see the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess though that negotiating those relationships is a lot of work. Yeah, it's expensive. It's as well, it costs money and time.
Because CERN is an institution in that sense, and just to follow up with the consideration of, okay, let's try then to get rid of those. Division of practices, we are full of unlearning, decolonizing practices trying to establish bridges between all those multidisciplinary fields that can potentially interact forever. But then, when it comes to institutional collaboration that can really truly build this kind of access, it's very interesting because fact in that sense has a very important role.
Thank you.
I think I have this perception, which that's also why I really like the way how it operates. But I was just wondering how this happens.
Let's see how it works out. Like, you know, it is an experiment in itself, and you know, it might be rubbish.
But it's very good. It's happening.
But I think just to add to that, I think what's really important about that, and something that I've experienced as an artist who's tried to engage scientists for a long time, and only when I came back with the science degree did my level of access deepen. And Bruno Latour, of course, talks about this in Laboratory Life, and it's very kind of classical anthropological in-group, out-group stuff, but this idea of cognitive authority. And I think science still has a cognitive authority socially that maybe art doesn't, or a slightly different form of cognitive authority. And I think this project is actually challenging, hopefully will challenge that in quite fundamental ways.
When you talk to people about science art, they say, oh, I guess you need digital art, you need computers.
Yeah, that's the technology.
Yeah, I want to say to all of you actually, do you think there's as many artists as possible can join that relationship, or is it about computing and digital art?
I don't think it's got anything to do with computers. Obviously they're very prevalent, so it's interesting to hear about James Bridle, isn't it, and his concept of a new aesthetic, which in vernacular terms could be VAR. I'm quite interested in this sort of mimetic around VAR, if anyone's watching the World Cup. Like, the VAR dialogue's becoming more interesting than the football. And at what point, I've noticed quite a few commercial ads on telly, which are basically using VAR as a story in terms of personal relationships. So, are we moving to a society which would, in a way, like to remove all ambiguity? And of course, we've had ocular histories, whether that's through, I can never say the word, even though my dad did it, microscopy. So in terms of ocular technologies moving through to metadata and supercomputing, which have, to most people are very inaccessible until they have a representation attached to them, hence the interest of Vincent Monnier or Andy here to collaborate with artists that can create aesthetic effect. So no, I don't think it's about computing. However, we're living in a culture where that in itself is the prevalent medium driving force for societal change. Therefore, it's both the subject and the medium If that helps.
I think it's interesting. I think if you went round quite a few of my colleagues and you talked about art science and then the sort of crossover or whatever you want to call it, and then you talked about digital art, they'd say, oh, that's not real art. They wouldn't see it as that because their perception of art is something outside of what they do for all the wrong reasons. But they do computers, so it can't be. I think, so I agree, a lot of people you talk to will see that as science art, but most scientists wouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this issue of and I touched on it a little bit, this idea of the technology and the digital, it becomes a kind of a medium of expression. But the art and science questions that I'm personally interested in are almost like kind of first principles or more meta questions of really interrogating what are these sort of values in terms of knowledge systems. And just to go back to James Bridle, actually sort of something he said the other evening, but it's also in his book, he says that it's simply, he's really cautioning around, offering a caution around literacy and questioning our ability now, how literate are we in relation to sort of the very computational sort of big data world? Like, do we understand the systems that we sign up to? You know, on a very simple level, sort of social media terms and conditions, and you know, and what is done with our data. I mean, all of this GDPR stuff that we're getting, he was sort of referred to that as like a banner ad for all the kind of data that is being collected about us as we engage in different digital platforms. And he said that a simply functional understanding of systems is insufficient. One needs to be able to think about consequences too. Where did these systems come from? Who designed them and what for? And which of these intentions still lurk with them today? So he talks about the dangers of computational thinking, or what he calls solutionism. He says, as these systems dominate, we begin to believe the world really is as the solutions propose, making it increasingly difficult to articulate the world in terms that are not computable. So if you kind of go into that like super computable way, like we can metrically sort of capture everything, we run the risk of being... So it's a kind of that balance between empirics and poetics, I suppose, as well, which I think is really important to kind of keep a hold of. I mean, one of my most favorite stories is the story of the two surrealists, Andre Breton and Robert Calois, watching Mexican jumping beans. I've been using this as a kind of way of talking about my practice for, 15 years now. So they're watching these Mexican jumping beans, and they had this massive fight because Calois wanted to cut the bean to understand why the bean jumped. And Breton was like, no, you don't need to cut the bean to understand why it jumps. That it jumps is enough. Like, you must just you must just appreciate the beauty of it jumping. And such was their fight that Calois resigned from the Surrealists the very next day, because they had this complete impasse of these two knowledge systems that they were like, it was a deal breaker for them. And I think that kind of sums up part of that relationship.
We have time for one last question, if anyone has a burning question to end.
I'm also on the side. I've been to a talk once before about dark matter, and at that time it hadn't been proven, and they were talking about it being disproven, and the science, there's a scientific approach to things. And I just remember when there was that murder in South Africa with Pistorius, and the girl who murdered his girlfriend, she had created artworks that had a mission. And there were two of them, I don't know if you ever saw them. And
that Riva Pistorius, Riva Steenkamp herself had made?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Did you not?
No.
Because her parents were interviewed, and it was quite hair-raising, because one of them was in the position she was actually found, with her knees up next to the toilet seat. And the other one was when she was a bit younger, she was in school, and I think there was a tree, and there was a bloke stood under the tree with a gun in his hand, which would have been her boyfriend who shot her. And then there was a ladder and angels above or something like that. And it kind of made me wonder, because I have created one or two unintentional artworks where it seemed premonition. And it's not something I want to go into or say I do, but it kind of made me wonder, there's the science of disproving something, and it made me wonder about telepathy, and having premonition. I guess there's something scientific that goes on in the artist's mind when they are being creative, comes up with an idea. So it's fun.
You should definitely come to our live interpretation that's happening in the gallery tomorrow morning, if you can, at 11, with a LJMU scientist, Dr. Matteo Barini, who is also a magician. So,
As I say, it's not something I particularly, believe in going into, but it kind of, it's when you think of the artwork, the painting, and how, it's 1873 by Turner, and it kind of reflected the universe. And it is going into a different imaginary world.
space-time continuum, Andy.
Well, we've done that tonight, but both of us to have been haunted by our parents. Yeah, they've come into the present. Yeah, and maybe that's enough.
Well, I worked a lot with elderly. I was doing care, and I can say that sometimes also, it's a passing. I get a call the next day from somebody who's been working and they tell me about it. So, there is that dimension, and I don't think we're alone, in that. But it just kind of makes you think of the human mind
and linearity and new scientific thinking, which will disprove loads of narratives. And in the process of doing as we speak,
I think we'll finish on that. So I'd like to give a round of applause to our speakers again.